Welcome to the Georgetown Literary Festival 2021, Microcosmos, and to this conversation with Tim Parks. A formal introduction to Tim Parks can be found on the back sleeve of any one of his many books. I have the privilege of taking a more intimate approach. I first met Tim Parks in 1993, and though our meetings since then have been few and very far between, the memory of my first meeting with Tim remains vivid, affectionate, and instructive. By the banks of the Malacca River, with the legendary water lizard Arjuna bombing in and out of the waters, Tim Parks spoke of word music, the framing of novels, and all the possibilities contained in a sentence yet to be written, transforming my understanding of literature altogether. And of the secrets of Samuel Beckett, who has since become my desert island author. Over the years, I have followed Tim Parks' writing with an ardor that some close to me might describe as near religious. His brilliantly crafted novels, books of non-fiction, including his most recent Italian Life and The Hero's Way, his indispensable essays in the New York Review and London Review of Books that instruct me to be a more careful reader. And it is through his hand that I was bequeathed the gift of writers such as Italo Calvino, Alberto Moravio, Antonio Tabucchi, and the oracle at the center of my own work in myth and ritual, Roberto Calasso. His translation of Machiavelli's The Prince, published just a few years ago, made me wish that this was the translation at hand when I, as a young undergraduate, studied and became enamored with this philosopher of the Renaissance. In that early meeting with Tim, I mentioned that Joseph Brodsky had referred to him, then still a young novelist, as the best British author writing today. Tim replied, he must have been drunk. The late, great Brodsky might well be vindicated in his praise today. Following on from the title of one of his essay collections, we speak of, sometimes dance around, many things in this conversation entitled Travel, Translation, and Other Diversions. I thank Tim Parks for being a part of this conversation, and thank you for joining us for the Georgetown Literary Festival. Tim Parks, thank you very much for joining me for this Georgetown Literary Festival conversation. It's a great shame that we can't be talking face to face, but given the brave new world we're living in, it seems to be the trend for the time being. So perhaps I can lurch into the questions. Yes.
It's great to see you anyway. Yeah, obviously we all regret not actually being there, but we'll do our best.
Yes, well, you're all Malaysia hands, so we hope that we'll be able to bring you back. Just to let you know that your books arrive always very, very much on time on our shelves. So
Fantastic.
I'm anticipating quite a fan base here. But we're called Travel, Literature, and Other Diversions, I think our title. So let me begin by asking you that we were commemorating the 700th death anniversary of Dante. And I recall reading one of your essay reviews to Hell and Back, which later became a title for one of your very fine collection of essays, where you point to the power of allegory as being so important to Dante. And what do you think continues to animate Dante, in particular for translators who so conscientiously work on him in a variety of forms and meters, and especially into the English language? What is his appeal up till today, you think?
Dante's probably the only figure in Italy who never divides people. You know, Italians tend to be divided over almost every historical figure. Dante, fortunately, is right there at the beginning, and everybody loves him. When you read the kind of scholarly analyses of the Inferno and the Commedia in general, you do see this attempt to explain it all in allegorical terms. You know, the the poet going through hell is sort of every man, and the guide who's guiding him is not just Virgil, but is sort of human wisdom, and then Beatrice is sort of divine love. But really, actually, I think the commedia works because it's actually not simply an allegory, because the poet is actually Dante going through hell, and Dante saying, "I am a great poet." You know, I mean that he was pretty much megalomaniac in terms of his convictions of his brilliance. I mean, right at the beginning of the poem, we remember Homer and Horace and Virgil himself and others accept Dante as one of the few great poets of all time. I mean, if you did that today, people would be laughing you out of the room, as it were. So one of the fantastic things um, about the Commedia is this tension between a book that's about the great things, sin, virtue, what happens after you die, and so on. And at the same time, it's about everybody Dante's ever known and whether he wants to put them in hell or heaven, and his discussions with them. And we remember that he wrote the book in exile. He had been kicked out of Florence during some factional trouble, which is a typical Italian problem. Italy's always about factions and about people being excluded or included in government. He was kicked out. Life for him was Florence, and hell was anything outside Florence. So, the people in hell are not so much dead as outside Florence, and they all want to be back. And he was writing the poem in the hope that he could flatter the right people to get back into Florence. And he keeps changing the people he flatters as he goes through the poem, because the people in Florence are changing. So one of the great things about the poem is that it's really about life as it's lived in Italy today, even though it's theoretically in hell. As for the translation, well, I mean, the first thing is it's a fantastic piece of literature, and so it presents itself as a challenge. But I think the thing that really sort of becomes an obsession of translators is this form of verse that he wrote it in. He wrote it in little triplets, little 3-line sections, okay, where the first line and the last line rhyme, and the middle line rhymes with the first line of the next triplet, okay. And each line is self-contained. He almost never runs on to the next line, okay. So the effect of it is that the poem is actually incredibly fast. It kind of trips along really fast. And there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is, if you're going through hell, you have to keep moving. Because if you stop to contemplate suffering, it's too awful. And in fact, frequently, Virgil, who's the guide, keeps saying to Dante, look, don't stop. Don't start feeling pity for these people. Keep moving. He actually says it. So the verse has to keep moving to get you through. So it's a verse that evokes suffering, but it also sort of moves suffering aside constantly. And that's a huge challenge for any translator, to get that kind of effect, the evocation and the movement. It's a huge challenge. And I think people do it because you can't do it. If you can do something, it sort of ceases to become interesting. But when you can almost do it, but you never really can, then that makes it fascinating.
Do you think there's a moral hold he still has on our imaginations?
I wouldn't call it a moral hold, but there's something that happens in the Inferno, particularly, that I think did become central to Western thinking, and that's this. Dante set out to do this poem about going through hell, where he would show where different people had ended up. Okay. then he starts contemplating the suffering of these people, and it begins particularly, I think, when he considers the suffering of Paolo and Francesca, the two adulterers who are in hell, and he starts to show pity for them. Okay, so you have this tension between our values today that we don't really think that Paolo and Francesca really deserve to be punished for all eternity for this. And at the same time, our religion and its rigid precepts, which demands that they suffer. So you begin to get this tension between a more modern position, which is forgiving and loving and so on and so forth, or that simply doesn't recognize that this is a sin, or a crime. And then on the other hand, this set of rules. And if we're going to talk about it later, you can bring that into the present where we now have an even greater tension between present virtues as we understand them. Like, the modern world considers that it has now reached sort of maximum virtue in its acceptance of more or less every form of behavior, and its complete condemnation of the past. Okay. So today, if people went to heaven, they'd say to God, "Look, God, you've got to abolish hell. We can't leave those people in hell. We wouldn't accept it." And that really begins with Dante. I mean, I think Dante pretty much destroys hell because he just shows that it's a completely unacceptable idea. So I think that does still resonate with people.
Yeah, this idea of virtue, we'll return to it a little later, yeah, because it's so much a part of what's seizing our our state of being at the moment. But I want to draw you to the theme of this festival, which is Microcosmos, reference to Bartok, but little universes. You're well known to be a rather difficult and complicated writer. And these little universes, that's widely acknowledged, I think. But these little universes settle in your work, and you get all these resonances of predecessors, Beckett and Thomas Bernhard. And in so many of your interviews and your conversations, you talk so much about words. But in this age of the declarative, rather than the elusive sentence in literature and so much else in collective life, where would you locate words and language today?
Well, in terms of microcosmos, let's say that it's obvious that all of us have our particular backgrounds and the particular texts and the particular places that we're coming from. Not only the environment we grew up in, but the particular books that we first fell in love with, or the books that were important to us at formative moments. And let's say, sort of more generally, that in a culture that's still, or a community that's still very much in contact with its past and with its masterpieces, like the Italians with Dante, then you can very quickly, as a member of that community, evoke very large and complex areas of feeling and emotion by simply alluding to something. The Wasteland is the classic example of this, where we know that Eliot throws out these fragments from previous texts, and on the one hand he's saying how much the world is fragmented, but on the other, actually, he's showing how strong the community still is if these fragments still have an effect on people. If you throw those fragments out today, very likely nobody will even notice that they're fragments from previous texts. So elusiveness very much has to do with it seems to me, with a community of culture that is still very much in contact, where one word can recall, like, this is a word that is used in the Bible in a certain way, or this is a phrase that is used, like that way of turning the phrase is typically Shakespearean or typically biblical. So, and that's very powerful. I mean, literature can become very powerful when you have that level of density. Obviously, if you move into a situation where we want to be globalized and we want to be immediately reading every text from different cultures all at the same time, uh, you get into a kind of strange form of provincialism. You could call it a sort of chronological provincialism, where we only know about the present, the latest book from Nigeria or the latest book from India, uh, and we're not connecting that to the past and so on. And so all that elusiveness in language becomes much more difficult because you're not appealing to a home community. Indeed, the idea of home community has become a sort of bad idea at the moment. You know, so this is the world we find ourselves in. I'm not saying that one can't have wonderful literature in in this kind of situation, but it's a different kind of literature. And obviously, somebody like me grew up in that other world, grew up studying. Like I grew up in an evangelical household where the Bible was read out loud every day. I studied literature in a situation where literature still seemed to be, intact and important. And then during my lifetime, all that's changed. And so I find myself quite interestingly between two worlds. What else can one say about this except it is pointless to regret the past passing because this is obviously something that's happening and much larger than any intervention that you or I might engage in. On the other hand, one has a sort of duty to register these changes, I think.
You say that, but you have always worked in multiplicities, haven't you? It's, between languages, between cultures, and even in your books, you enter all kinds of incredible territory, from psychoanalysis. You've had an incarnation as a crime novelist, and people find that there is a certain kind of loopiness to your loopiness, as I'm quoting from a review, that is very appealing. And what they find in your literature, of course, is that the one consistent theme is the situational. That somehow people find themselves in situations that they neither created themselves but can't seem to get out of, and that gives way to all the irony and humor in your fiction. Is this the purpose of fiction, you think? To describe this kind of absurdity? Is there even a purpose to fiction?
Well, far be it from me to pronounce on purposes for fiction. I mean, people can do what they want, and if they can excite us with it, or instruct us, so much the better. Let me try and put some sense into my own work. As I said, I grew up in a situation which was extremely intense. I grew up in a situation of an evangelical, charismatic religion household where people carried out exorcisms and had prophecies and read the Bible constantly. So this is clearly a situation which is both formative, but also that you want to escape from, as it were. And so an enormous amount of my work, in fact, I would say all my work, is really about how the question of identity of the individual is created in a group. That identity is a thing you do together. There is nothing absolute about about your identity. Okay, it's created in the group, and so one of the reasons why my fiction has looked at so many different areas is precisely to show this happening in different places in different ways. For example, the Italian books are very much about, what does it, is the individual in Italy the same as the individual in the UK, the culture I grew up in? What are the forces, what are the possibilities open to an Italian individual that are not open to somebody in the UK, and vice versa? What are the examples, the role models, the habits and so on and so forth. Why is it that somebody like Margaret Thatcher is unthinkable in Italy, and somebody like Giulio Andreotti, the great, possibly corrupt prime minister of the Christian Democrat era, why is he utterly unthinkable in the UK? So. So again, these books are very much about how identity is created, in groups. They could be families, they can be larger groups, and so on. And also in the era you live in, because in a different era, I mean, it's clear. Recently, I've been writing about the 19th century, about Italian unity, about Garibaldi. It's clear that a figure like Garibaldi really couldn't exist today in the circumstances we're in today. So all my work is about that tension between the self-realization as an individual, but also the fact that you're a product of a group as well, and of a language as well. Language is obviously crucial in the structuring of a group and a person. So, I mean, I'm not saying that these are academic books, but just that I'm very aware of those tensions.
And talk about, let us enter this very dangerous territory of culture. You mentioned culture earlier.
Let's try not to say something that will lead to us being threatened with death or something.
A near everyday experience, it seems to be in our world these days.
Right.
But the books that you've written on Italy, and I've read all of them with great relish. Particularly fond of the seasons in Verona, and you've waded into exploring Italian life as somebody who's lived there, but I don't know. Have you lived there on the margins? I'm not sure. But how much are these books an exploration of that idea of culture, whether such a thing actually even exists?
Well, let me say that I've lived in Italy for 40 years, okay? And for about 36 of those years, I worked in the university. And I came to have a role as a professor in a university and ran a university course and wrote articles for the newspapers and so on and so forth. So I have sort of been involved in Italian life. My three children are all Italian. My ex-wife and also my present wife are Italian. So this is very much a total immersion, What happened was that I simply started trying to understand the way my own personality, the way my own forms of behavior were being obliged to change. One's own expectations of, for example, relationships in a job, how you get a job, how you continue in the job, all the kind of things that you have to negotiate when you do a job. You have to change because it's a different world and there are different expectations and so on and so forth. And so that leads you to beginning to understand, here you have this huge inertia or momentum, if you want, that goes forward century after century. I started reading when I came to Italy contemporary texts, or more or less contemporary post-war authors like Natalia Ginsburg or Alberto Moravia, Elsa Morante, and so on. And then slowly I began to read back in Italian literature. Verga, Manzoni, Leopardi, and then further and further back, Ariosto, and then finally back to Boccaccio and Dante and so on. And you begin to see an extraordinary continuity in forms of behavior and ways of doing things that are clear. I mean, they're not genetic, for heaven's sake. You move an Italian to London, and after a few years, they'll start behaving like that. Or the Italians have a wonderful expression, inglese italianizzato, uomo demonizzato, or something like that, which just says if an English person becomes Italianized, they're even more demonic, as it were, than the local. So, so the Italian books are really very much about that system and what it is, all its positive and negative sides. And the relationship between the way that in the book Italian Life in particular, I'm constantly putting side by side old Italian fables, the plots of Italian novels, and the situation of working in a university. And you begin to see that, that literature and life are not disconnected. The kind of stories that are produced in Italian novels are different from the stories produced in American or English novels. And they're very similar to the way one lives here.
The next question. I have just every time one of your new books comes out, I'm grabbing it, partly as an act of faithfulness. But I must say that I have particular. So this is a bit of an indulgence, this question, because I have a particular love for two of your books. Teach Me to Sit Still, and my favorite of your novels, which is Dreams of Rivers and Seas, which I thought very lyrical. Teach Me to Sit Still, I was reading to friends and we were literally falling off the chair in some parts. Mm-hmm. But can you tell me what this tilt to India was during that period of your writing this book?
Well, I'd been to India for work. I had translated Roberto Calasso's book Ka, and I was invited to go to India. And this happened to me at a time in my life which was a very difficult time. A very difficult time, both physically with health problems, but also personally with marriage problems and so on. And if we try to connect this with our conversation so far, let me say that India, if one is an individual, one's identity depends to a large extent on the environment you're in and the group you're with and so on. India, for me, was simply a place of total disorientation, where I couldn't really find who I was at all, because the stuff going on around you when you move away from the sort of cozy world of intellectuals and conferences. I remember I spent a long time in Delhi at one point. I decided to do what they tell you never to do in India, which is just walk around the streets for about 3 weeks. It was a completely crazy experience, apart from the heat. But so, the book Dreams of Rivers and Seas is a book about disorientation. I was disoriented in my life anyway, going through big changes, and India really called to me on that. Add to that I had very curiously, precisely at that moment, translated Calasso's book Ka, which is about pre-Vedic and Vedic thinking and mythology, both Hindu and pre-Hindu. So it all sort of fit together, and it was fun to try and do something with all that.
Talking about Calasso, so much of Italian literature has come to us who read in English through your hand. People like Calvino, and Tabucchi, Moravia, Leopardi, even Machiavelli recently. Can you tell me a little bit about, this is getting off track a little bit, but, living writers that you actually translated, people like Calvino, what was your relationship like with them? And what does it mean to translate a living writer as compared to somebody who is, in the distant past?
Well, I think it is very interesting, especially Calasso, alas, has now died just a couple of months ago. And it's very curious, because I was still working on the corrections of a translation. And it's very curious when he's gone, and I can't ask him where there's a problem, and I can't. I can very much remember and feel his presence because Calasso had a very particular presence, a very singular figure. Um, but now the decision's much more mine, you know. Like one of the problems of translating an author who's alive is that they can start bothering you, you know. An author who's dead will not do that. On the other hand, they can help you, and fortunately, Calasso had excellent English, but he also knew that my written English was was much more aware of all the elusiveness of English than his was. So he was very supportive and helpful, and basically just intervened when there was something difficult from a semantic point of view, you know. But the thing about if I can just say quickly, Calasso's work is all about myth and the myths of different cultures, and his position is that myth is always present, that there is, you know, it's not something from the past, that the present still works in terms of mythological stories and so on. And as a result of that, his style is a very strange mix of the archaic, slightly Vatic, but also extremely contemporary and often very abrupt and so on. And when I was first asked to translate Calasso, I saw at once that my own background with Bible reading and with the whole area of English that we've already talked about, that, you know, that awareness of the past of English and the present of English, put me in an excellent position to translate these books. So it was fun to do that. I mean, you can think about translation. Perhaps an easy way to think about it is, what happens if I move this building that is typical of this culture? I don't know, the Taj Mahal or the Leaning Tower of Pisa. You know, what happens if I move this to New York? What happens if I move this to London, or if I move it to Kuala Lumpur or to Bangkok? You know, how does it fit in? What effect does it have? What does it lose in losing its relation to the buildings around it? You know, um, and how do I have to change the building a little bit to make it a little bit more congruent? You know, but not so much as to lose what made it interesting. So you could think of translation that way. And it's a pleasure when the building you're working with is both very particular, but also possible to work with, you know, and Calasso is definitely possible to work.
Well, Calasso is very unique, distinctive, no? Because there are so many acts of translation that are actually going on. He is a translator himself, in a sense. And, you know, that wonderful essay you wrote, Prajapati, deals with some of these difficulties in a very sensual way. But it seems as you were talking about those buildings, translation is so much an act of transmigration, something like that. Could it be described that way?
Yeah, but let's take the two extreme positions. The position that the publishing world wants you to believe is that everything is immediately, universally translatable and can be sold everywhere. So, you know, people will say to you, I believe every great work of literature can be translated everywhere, you know, and it sounds like a very noble thing to say, but at the same time, it means we can make a lot of money selling this everywhere at once, and it's always the same work of art. Okay. So that's one extreme position. And of course, the other extreme position is, no, this work is totally embedded in its culture. It can only be understood in reference to the people around it and the circumstances that gave rise to it. And so it can't be translated at all. Okay. And of course, the reality is that we read books from other cultures. If we're lucky enough to know the language, we like the book. And maybe we think, let's see what we could do with this in English, and something comes out that's mostly the same, but also very different. And really, it very much depends how much a book is locked into its own culture and self-referential to its own language, for example. If you have a book that is basically about the English language, okay, or that depends entirely on making every word slightly different from what the English language is, but nevertheless understandable through that difference, to think of Finnegan's Wake, then frankly, translation begins to look kind of pointless. I mean, you can do a similar exercise, but it's hard to see what translation would mean. But with other books, usually, usually there's something useful to be done. Like you're perfectly right that Calasso, as he's working from all kinds of different cultures from the past, which he is translating very much in his own way. And when I translated Calasso, he would always insist that I translate his Italian, that I don't go back to previous translations of the text he was translating from. And this was particularly next month we'll be publishing his last book, which is called The Book of Books, and which is about the Bible, the Old Testament. So for me, that was very special because, as I say, I grew up reading the Bible, and there you have the problem. You have the problem that he's constantly quoting from the Bible. That British people, well, some British people of my age perhaps, know the Bible, and yet his translation is certainly not exactly like the authorized version, or not exactly. There are a million versions of the Bible. So it was fun sort of mediating between exactly what he had written in Italian and what the sometimes very famous existing translations of the Bible in English say. But there's no absolute with all this stuff. You do what you can, and you bring to it. I think there's no absolute, but nevertheless, the more you can bring to it, and the more you've thought about it, then the more intense and the more rewarding the book can be. So the fact that it's not an absolute should never be an invitation to incompetence, in short.
What you bring to it, one of the things that delights me most and seems to keep our friendship very animated for 30 years, although we've seen each other 3 times maybe, is the fact that I read you
I think that's
everywhere.
The same number of times that Dante saw Beatrice. I wouldn't want to put our relationship in that.
But I'm able to read you, as I said, everywhere. And so much you write about is about reading, how closely you read things and how intimately you read them. And so many of your essays are also devoted to them. There are collections of them, which are an absolute delight, Out of My Head and things like that. Tim, tell me, where do you situate reading in our gadget-driven world today, beyond all these publisher surveys and statistics, which of course say so much but tell you so little?
Well, I thought it's that reading is getting a bit more difficult. Human beings are compulsive creatures, and you put a mobile phone in their hands, and a very large amount of their day is going to disappear with checking their email and so on. And I'm no exception to that. If we try to link to what the conversation has been about so far, like if my identity is being formed by my family, for example, reading offers the chance of expanding the things that are forming my identity, right? So, for example, in my family, which was so biblical and so closed in the evangelical experience, the possibility to read novels, to read Tolstoy, read Dostoevsky, read Flaubert, and so on, which my parents respected because they had that kind of middle-class respect that literature is good, even though they didn't really know the contents of what I was reading. So reading for me was a chance of enriching and escaping from a closed world. Okay. And I've always remained close to that idea that reading can lead you usefully out of things, or give you a view on things. I think, one of the questions about the way a person reads is whether they're always reading into their comfort zone, like the way people choose the newspapers that give them the political opinion that they want to see reinforced, or the political narrative that they want to have. And a lot of people read books like that, or just books that create a space that they're familiar with, or create, for example, liberal opinions that they're happy with, but 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 maybe not entirely congruent with the nature of reality, or whatever. I think it's useful and important to be lured outside your comfort zone, and I think the seductiveness of a good writer is his ability to sort of put it a spell on somebody, and bring them a little bit out of the place where they were. So, my in the moments when I'm positive, and these moments are not all that many, but in the moments when I'm really positive about literature and reading and writing, I think of it as offering the possibility to really safely, because you're never in terrible danger when you're with a book, or unusually, not usually, of being drawn into at least challenging your complacencies and so on and so forth, or escaping from, certainly for me, Calasso was very important in that way, of offering me new vistas, but other writers too, of course.
And can we now fall back? I'm sorry, the conversation is sprawling, but your work is like that, so I just have to run with it. But can we talk a little bit about your latest book, The Hero's Way, and Garibaldi, and what drew you to this? I mean, I know there was a piece published in the New Yorker 2007, I think, The Insurgent. But now a full book has happened. And Garibaldi is, in this age of political correctness, in the age of questioning the nation state, where does he sit, and what was his appeal to you?
Okay, it's interesting that you think the conversation's sprawling, because again, to me, it seems actually quite focused. So maybe we're always talking about individual and community. And that is the case with Garibaldi as well. I should say very quickly that remarkably, at school when I was 16, 17, for my special subject for A level, I chose completely at random the Italian Risorgimento, so the unification of Italy, and how it became independent as a country. And so I knew about Garibaldi and the other major figures in the Risorgimento, even when I was quite young. And then, remarkably, destiny led me through my wife to come and live in Italy, and so on, where probably Via Garibaldi or Piazza Garibaldi or Corso Garibaldi is a street, the most named street all over Italy. Okay, so. I had become interested, and partly the whole European Union experience and the Brexit experience, I'd become interested in, the nation state, which of course is being looked at very negatively now, as we move to try a sort of world global government through large organizations like the EU or the World Health Organization and so on and so forth. But if one goes back to the 19th century, into Italy, which was split up into a dozen little states, very much under the control of the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the Catholic Church, which was not simply an Italian phenomenon, of course. If we go back to the 19th century, the liberal community at the time felt that freedom could only be achieved if a people was united and self-governing. Okay. They didn't believe that freedom was an inevitable product of a people being united and self-governing. They knew it was possible for a people to be united and governed by a tyrant. Okay, so they were aware of that. But they did believe that it was a necessary condition for arriving at a state where people could be free, where freedom was understood as being able to realize what abilities you had, and being able to express the opinions you had with a certain freedom. I mean, they weren't stupid in any way in imagining any kind of absolute freedom. And the most amazing, the most colorful, the most determined, and the most charismatic figure in the Italian process of the Risorgimento was Garibaldi, who was at once militarily an extraordinary figure of a man capable of leading armies of volunteers and beating professional armies. But he was also, in his way, although this is often debated, he was also, in his way, a thinker and a practitioner of freedom. He was obsessed with freedom, simply obsessed. The way he dressed, his private life, and so on and so on. Well, it so happened that it just came onto my radar in a way to think about the moment in 1849 when Garibaldi had been fighting for the very short-lived Roman Republic, which in 1849 tried to free Rome from the Pope and to move towards a unified state. Those ambitions and hopes were crushed by a huge French army which besieged the town and cannoned the town into submission. Garibaldi refused to surrender, and he got together about 4,000 or 5,000 volunteers, and he tried to take them across Italy northwards to Venice, where there was another free republic holding out. So this was a march of 630 kilometers, that's about 400 miles, zigzagging northwards through Italy, through Lazio, Umbria, Tuscany, the marches, with lots of armies, French armies and Austrian armies following him and trying. And I just thought one day, it just occurred to me, why don't we, I and my wife, why don't we do that march that they did? You know, why don't we reconstruct it and talk about Italy today, the Italy we're walking through, the Italy of 1849, and talk about this adventure, because it was a considerable adventure. And it was also a question of, you know, what you could do politically at the time. You know, what kind of agency people had. Like today, how much agency does any of us really feel we have in the very few of us are entirely happy with the governments and the situations we live in. What kind of agency do we have? You know, in Italy, you even begin to wonder if your vote is a form of agency, given that we have a prime minister who was not elected by parliament or even in any parliamentary party, but as it were, parachuted into us when forces of various kinds decided that we weren't behaving properly. So the book is about that, you know. So on the one hand, it's a kind of love declaration to this landscape and these people and so on. And on the other hand, a quite critical analysis and awareness of both the situation in the past and the situation in the present. I mean, you know, it seems very important as a writer to keep changing, to keep moving out of your comfort zone as a writer, to say, you know, how can I do this book? How can I put the present and the past together in an interesting way? How can I make it seductive for readers, but also take readers to a position that they don't expect to be in, where the nation state maybe becomes something extremely attractive compared with what was going on before it, and so on and so forth. So it was fun, you know. It's what I do as a job.
Coming out of Garibaldi, and this is our last question, I really wish we could sit and talk for a great deal longer. But coming out of this experience, encountering today, you know, a culture that is screaming for historical justice, and so much of literature is under scrutiny. We talked about Dante, and I just remember that in 2012 there was an Italian human rights group that called for his banning because he was apparently an Islamophobe. Now, what is going on, Tim? What is going on? Seriously, because some of us on this side of the world read with consternation that Mark Twain, Joseph Conrad, none of these people are legitimate anymore. And recently, Cornel West, cried out that we are undergoing a spiritual catastrophe. Can you please try and capture this zeitgeist for us as we conclude?
Well, I mean, Dante's Commedia obviously draws on the Christian scheme of things, where homosexuals, for example, are placed in hell. This is clearly unacceptable today. So what are we going to do? We're going to say all the qualities, all the thinking, all the reflection, all the culture in Dante is to be thrown away because the values of his time are not our values. Okay? So if we're going to do that, then we move into a sort of delirium where we imagine that our own virtues are in fact absolute. The past is all inferior and and to be disdained. Okay. And we assert what I'm always disagree with, that our identity is somehow absolute and absolutely right, and the past wrong. Okay. And this is a denial of the fact that our present position actually arises from the past, and that Dante at his time had considerably moved from previous positions that came before him. I talked before about how he shows pity for people in hell and how he respects people he meets in hell, which already at the time the Christian church condemned Dante's work as not orthodox. Okay. So not to see oneself in terms of a process that's been ongoing, that you can talk about as progress or you can talk about simply as change, is folly. And it seems to me also that this is largely born of a situation where, as you move away from a world where there were complex hierarchies to do largely with religious beliefs, or to do with the notion of separate roles, men and women, people of different birth, and so on and so forth. As you move away from that to a world of total equality, hopefully, although we all know perfectly well that that's not the case, you move, as the great anthropologist Louis Dumont said, into a world where competition is really the only way of relating to people. You're in a power struggle. And the biggest weapon in the power struggle at the moment is your virtue. One should always ask, when people express their concern about victims and about so, one should always ask whether the concern is really about the victim and born of compassion of this person, or whether it is a concern about asserting a position which improves my power in the modern world. Because most of what is going on is a power struggle. Okay. Where there is genuine compassion and a genuine attempt to rectify unhappy circumstances, who could possibly dispute the need to defend any kind of minority? But we should always be attentive to that question, whether what is going on here is a sort of delirium of self-assertion or not. And I fear that very largely that's the case. I mean, it's certainly crazy to suggest that one can't benefit from reading somebody like Mark Twain. He's a man of infinite humanity. It's absurd, but there you go. We live in these times, and I do think there's alas more of this to come. More to come.
Tim Parks, we've reached the end of our time, but thank you very much, and always a great pleasure, always so much empathy, and thank you for wading through these little universes with me for this festival, and we look forward to having you here in person.
I would love to be there again, and thank you for all your generosity over the years, and sharp observations. Thank you.
I wish you great happiness, my friend. Thank you.